Welcome back to another ChronoLara video. Today we're going to have a paper summary on the Cold War. Let's get straight into the video so you can ChronoCram to get that top grade. Origins of the Cold War. Ideological differences between the two superpowers. The USA is a capitalist democracy versus the USSR, which is a communist dictatorship. There's been tension from the start due to these ideological differences. However, they were in a temporary alliance in World War II in order to defeat the Axis powers. The Axis powers are Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. Peace conferences. Tehran takes place in November 1943. USA under Roosevelt and UK under Churchill opened a second front, which was a request from the Soviet Union. Poland would gain land from Germany but lose land to the Soviet Union, which was under Stalin. Next, you have the Yalta Conference in February 1945. Germany would be split into four zones, one under France, US, UK, and USSR. USSR also agreed to help the USA with their war in Japan, and the UN is in the process of being established. Potsdam Conference, which takes place from July to August 1945. Nazi Party was banned and war criminals were to be prosecuted. Berlin is to be divided into four occupation zones: France, US, UK, and USSR. There are new leaders in the US and UK. US have Truman now and UK have Attlee. US also announced that they have an atomic bomb. This is important because this starts tensions. US dropped bombs on Japan, one in Hiroshima on the 6th of August 1945 and Nagasaki on the 9th of August 1945. Stalin was not consulted about this till last minute at the Potsdam Conference. This creates distrust. Now the arms race begins here. Stalin accelerates the USSR's atomic bomb project, and this leads to the first successful USSR atomic bomb test on the 29th of August 1949, ending the US nuclear monopoly. Telegrams. George Kennan, ambassador and works at the embassy at Moscow, sent an 8,000-word telegram called the Long Telegram. Called the Long Telegram because it's 8,000 words, quite long for a telegram. He sends it from the Moscow embassy to President Truman in February 1946. In brief, he says the USSR is aggressive and expansionist, and the USSR and communism had to be contained. In retaliation, Nikolai Novikov sent the Novikov telegram in September 1946 from Washington embassy to Stalin, and he just says the US want world domination and American people are more than happy to have a war with the USSR. Well, George Kennan had a point when he said they wanted a spread because there's Soviet expansion. In order, these countries are taken over by the USSR. If I were you, I would just remember 3 of these countries, but it's important to mention that most of these countries had governments installed by 1948, which are communist governments. Although Churchill is no longer Prime Minister of the UK, he has a very, very big influence and he's still very influential. In March 1946, he delivers his Iron Curtain speech, talking about the impenetrable divide between the communist East and the capitalist West. Development of the Cold War. Now, we're looking at the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Truman Doctrine in 1947. This doctrine stated that the USA will contain communism. Contain is different from actually rolling back. They are not actually intervening in attacking communism or going against them deliberately. They are trying to stop the spread of communism. And a way they do this is to make themselves look good by using the Marshall Aid. Now, prior to the Marshall Aid, they had sent 400 million to Turkey and Greece to prevent them from turning communism, and also they had sent 12.7 billion to Western European countries. However, this Marshall Aid sent 13 billion to 16 European countries in Western Europe to make themselves look amazing and make capitalism look like the protector of people. Stalin called the Marshall Aid dollar imperialism, and he responds with setting up Cominform on the 22nd of September 1947. Cominform allowed Stalin to direct and control satellite states, and he also sets up Comecon on the 25th of January 1949. Comecon is in response to the Marshall Plan. Think about it like this: it relates to money, economy. Alliances. NATO is created on the 4th of April 1949, and this is between USA and the Western Allies. The Warsaw Pact is made by the USSR and Eastern Europe on the 14th of May 1955. The military alliances raise the stakes and make military confrontation much more likely. Berlin blockade and the Berlin airlift. Stalin decides to block access routes from East Berlin to West Berlin and called this the Berlin blockade, and this began on the 24th of June 1948, in hope that the Western powers would just leave Berlin and he would have it all. However, the West respond with Operation Vitals, which is the code name for Berlin airlift, and this is just 2 days after, on the 26th of June 1948. During this period of time of the Berlin airlift, there was 277,000 Allied flights which carried 2.3 million tons of supplies being medicine, food, blankets, etc. Stalin ends this blockade on the 12th of May 1949. He realised the West weren't given so easily. This airlift lasts 318 days. Cold War intensifies. We have the arms race. In 1952, the USA test their first hydrogen bomb, and it's nicknamed Ivy Mike. The hydrogen bomb is 1,000 times more destructive than the atomic bomb. Year following, the USSR have their hydrogen bomb. By 1957, there's ICBMs. ICBMs stand for Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles. Now, the MAD theory comes about, mutually assured destruction. Mutually between the two, assured happening definitely, destruction to be ruined. They know that if they use their bombs against each other, there will be mutually assured destruction. Hungarian uprising. Now, Stalin dies on the 5th of March 1953. This leads to a new leader called Khrushchev. Khrushchev hates Stalin. He has this project called de-Stalinization, which gets rid of any Stalinist policies, monuments, etc. Now, this gives people hope that there will be a bit more freedom in the Soviet Union and they'll finally be kind to them. We got a new leader in Hungary, which is a satellite state, and this new leader is called Imre Nagy. Imre Nagy wants reforms. On the 3rd of November 1956, Nagy says he wants reforms and he wants to leave the Warsaw Pact. Now, this alarms Khrushchev. He's scared that the other satellite states are going to follow what Nagy does, and eventually communism will just go corrupt and fall. But then, on the 4th of November 1956, Khrushchev decides to send in 1,000 Soviet troops to invade. This ends up killing 2,500 Hungarians, and 200,000 of them end up fleeing. Now, Imre Nagy is executed on the 16th of June 1958, and Mr. Khrushchev has a very famous quote in which he says Nagy's execution is a lesson to all leaders of socialist countries. USA condemns this, however, they don't intervene. Now we're going on to Berlin. The Berlin Ultimatum. On the 27th of October 1958, Khrushchev issues his Berlin Ultimatum to the West. He demands that they leave Berlin within 6 months. Refugee crisis and the war. So, 2.7 million East Germans flee to the west of Berlin. This causes a brain drain and a skills gap. East Germany is starting to fail. Khrushchev decides to stop this issue by building a wall on the nightfall of the August 12, 1961. This wall is known as the Berlin Wall. This wall is a symbol of division until 1989, when the wall falls. Summits about Berlin. You've got 4 summits. First one, May 1959, the Geneva Summit. Relationships slightly improve between Khrushchev and Eisenhower. However, they have no agreements. Later, they meet in Camp David at Washington in September 1959. Khrushchev, he quotes that he went with open heart and good intentions. He's seen enjoying the Hollywood culture and eating hot dogs. Relationships improve, however, they have no agreements other than to meet in Paris the following year. Fortunately, everything goes down at Paris, because in May 1960, in the Paris summit, there has been an incident with a U-2 spy plane. An American U-2 spy plane is found doing its espionage flights over USSR. It's shot down and they find out there's a pilot called Gary and he's trained by the CAI. Eisenhower refuses to apologize about this, and this angers Khrushchev and he walks out the meeting. Cold War tensions rise from here. There's been no resolution from this summit. June 1961, Now we have a new US president, and his name is John F. Kennedy. Mr. John F. Kennedy comes into office at 43 years of age, and Khrushchev thinks he's actually quite inexperienced. He's also had an issue, Kennedy's had an issue earlier on in the year, which is quite embarrassing for him, known as the Bay of Pigs crisis. So Khrushchev restated his ultimatum, and now there is a very negative relationship between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Cuba. Bay of Pigs crisis, I was just talking about this. 17th of April 1961. Now, Cuba is 19 miles away from the US. Cuba is a communist country. Khrushchev cannot handle the fact that he's got a communist country 90 miles away from him, and he needs to make sure that they don't somewhat attack him. So he attacks first. On 17th of April 1961, 1,400 Cuban exiles, which are trained by the CIA, are sent to invade Cuba. However, they surrender in 24 hours because of Castro's army of 20,000 soldiers. This made the US look weak and not peaceful, going against their motto of being a protector of the people and peace. It's also very, very embarrassing for Kennedy and a very bad event in his presidency. Now, Castro, in fear of getting attacked again by the US, he talks to Khrushchev and he's like, hey, can you help me out? I've been feeling quite unsafe. So in September 1961, Khrushchev declared that the Soviet Union would give weapons to Cuba. Kennedy warns Khrushchev that there should not be any bombs, any missiles of the Soviet Union in Cuba. Khrushchev promises that there'll be nothing. However, that's not true, because on the 14th of October 1962, a U-2 spy plane of America's sees a USSR launch pads in Cuba. You can see Khrushchev is breaking his promise here. So on the 16th of October 1962, Kennedy assembles ExCom, an advisory group, and this is the beginning of the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. A lot of historians argue that this is the closest we've ever been to the world ending in history. So, 22nd of October 1962, Kennedy launches something called a naval quarantine. He calls it a quarantine because it doesn't sound as aggressive as a naval blockade. Now, last day of the 13 days is the 28th of October 1962. Khrushchev agrees to remove his weapons from Cuba, and Bobby Kennedy, which is the brother of John F. Kennedy, meets with the Soviet ambassador, and they agree to remove the NATO bombs from Turkey. However, this part of the agreement and the settling of the Cuban Missile Crisis actually wasn't made public until a few years after it. Next topic, Czechoslovakia. Let's look at the Prague Spring. Now, we have Alexander Dubček, who introduced reforms called socialism with a human face. Now, we have a new USSR leader called Brezhnev, who ousted Khrushchev out of power. Khrushchev fell in popularity, wasn't really liked after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Kennedy actually rose in popularity, but this is not the issue at hand. Brezhnev was worried that other Warsaw Pact countries might follow, very similar to the Hungarian uprising, with Khrushchev being scared that other countries would follow Naji's footsteps. But don't mix them up, guys. On the 20th of August 1968, 500,000 Soviet and Warsaw Pact tanks invade Czechoslovakia, restoring Soviet control. Dubček is arrested. Well, thank goodness he's not executed like Naj, and he's also replaced by Husak, a hardliner. Now, Czechoslovakia's Prague Spring led to the Brezhnev Doctrine. The Brezhnev Doctrine said the USSR will intervene if a communist country threatens the unity of the Eastern Bloc. Eastern Bloc, they are all together, joined by communism. If they try to break this bond, then sorry, you're going to get attacked. The West, once again, do not intervene with Czechoslovakia. Very similar to the Hungarian uprising, but do not mix up these two events. This happens in 1968, whereas the Hungarian uprising is in 1956. Detente. Detente is a French word which basically means just a relaxation of tensions and restoring peace. Now, why would both sides want to engage in detente? The USA are in a very, very expensive war called the Vietnam War. They have spent $84 billion on this war. and there has been a death of 60,000 US soldiers. There's been a huge economic strain and US are in big debt. USSR similarly having failing economy and a stagnation. They are not able to keep up. And both sides are just fearful of mutually assured destruction. Now, the aims of detente are to reduce tension and avoid war, given that both countries are struggling already and they don't want to get into a war. Now, a way they go on with detente is by making agreements. Now, first agreement is called SALT. SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. SALT 1 was signed in May 1972, and this limited ICBMs, intercontinental, I can't pronounce anything today, ballistic missiles, and SLBMs, submarine launched ballistic missiles. Now, they also have something called the Helsinki Accords, which were in the process of being signed from 1973 and then ended up being signed in August 1975. There were 3 baskets: a political, social, and economic basket. Now, there was one about human rights, one about borders in Europe being recognized, and one on agreements of technology. The technology one led to the Apollo-Soyuz test project. This is where we see the US and USSR actually make a project in outer space together, showing that they are actually going quite well with this detente thing. However, USSR was unhappy with the human rights basket, and the Soviet politicians just didn't think it was a good idea. Now, detente quickly ends. They have SALT 2. It never received ratification from the US Senate, and as a result, the SALT 2 agreement was never upheld by either the US or USSR. So quite a flop. Now, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. USSR supports communist government in Afghanistan, and they invade Afghanistan on the 24th of December 1979. The USA see it as expansionism, and this leads to the Carter Doctrine in January 1980, and also US boycott the Moscow Olympics, and they get 60 other nations to join them in 1980. Now, Mr. Ronald Reagan is the new US president, and he wins a landslide victory. Everyone thinks this guy will end communism. On the 8th of March 1983, he has this speech called the Evil Empire speech. He says that the Soviet Union is just basically an evil empire. Reagan didn't want to contain communism like the Truman Doctrine said. However, he actually wanted to physically go in himself and just end it, get it done with. Quite aggressive. Now, he sets up the SDI program. SDI stands for Strategic Defense Initiative. This SDI program was made public on the 23rd of March 1983. It's also nicknamed Star Wars. The SDI broke the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which was signed post-Cuban Missile Crisis. Little spoiler, the SDI they were nowhere close to actually getting this program made. It stated that they would be able to bomb countries from outer space. However, they did not even have the technology to be doing that. So it was a bit of a reach. US getting too ahead of themselves. The USSR can't keep up and they're quite scared now. The SDI forced them to reform, leading to Mikhail Gorbachev's policy, which is called New Thinking. End of Cold War. Now we're getting closer to ending this horrible war. Gorbachev has these new reforms called New Thinking. Gorbachev becomes the new leader of USSR in March 1985. Brezhnev dies. Then Brezhnev's succeeded dies. And then that guy dies. And then we finally got Gorbachev in. He's got 2 main parts of his new reform. Glasnost and perestroika. These are two Russian words, and I think these are the only Russian words you need to know for this paper. Glasnost means openness. There's going to be less censorship and freedom of speech. The USSR citizens will be a little bit more open and get to know what's going on in their country. Perestroika is the Russian word for restructuring. When they talk about restructuring, they're talking about restructuring the economy. They will be adding some capitalist elements to the economy. However, this is all going to help them. Also, they want to reduce the military spending. Historians predict that they were, at this time, the Soviet Union was spending 10 to 20% of their GDP on military spending. They also plan to remove any restrictions on foreign trade so that the economy can thrive. Additionally, Gorbachev ends the Brezhnev Doctrine, which stated that communist countries who try to break away from communism will get attacked. Now, Gorbachev's new thinking actually goes into action. There are 5 peace summits, and these are called the peace summits of the 1980s. The Geneva one is the first one and takes place in November 1985. There's a very positive working relationship between Reagan and Gorbachev. Can't pronounce it to save my life, but Reykjavik, which takes place in October 1986, improved relationships. However, the US could not give up the SDI. Washington, which takes place in December 1987. Here they signed the INF Treaty. INF stands for Intermediate Range Nuclear Force. The treaty agreed to abolish all land missiles with a range from 500 kilometers to 5,500 kilometers. Now you got Moscow, which took place in May to June 1988. Gorbachev agreed to reduce the number of Warsaw Pact soldiers, and also the Soviet Union agreed to leave Afghanistan. Malta took place in December 1989, and the first meeting with Gorbachev and the new US President George Bush. There's no agreements, however, both countries used this meeting to mark the end of the Cold War. We're getting even closer now, because here we got the collapse of communism and the Eastern Bloc, 1989 to 91. In order, countries fall from communism. First, June 1989, elections marked the end of communist rule in Poland and the Solidarity movement in Poland. May 1989, Hungary opens its border with Austria and elections are held in October. December 1989, the Velvet Revolution, which is a very famous revolution, overthrows the communist government in Czechoslovakia. December 1989, communist governments in Romania and Bulgaria fall. Romania have a violent end to communism. However, communism is abolished, thank goodness. For the US. December 1990, communist Yugoslavia breaks up into 7 independent states. Gorbachev, because he's ended the Brezhnev Doctrine, he doesn't need to intervene anymore. He just lets these communist countries fall from communism and do whatever they want. If I were you, I wouldn't memorize every single one of these. However, just memorize a few. Do what you can. The fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, on the 9th of November 1989, the East German government permits travel between East and West Berlin, and both East and West Germans begin to pull down the wall. This was actually an accident, was meant to happen, however, it was for the greater good. And now, October 1990, Germany is officially reunified. This marks a symbolic end of the Cold War and the end of the Iron Curtain that Churchill was talking about in 1946. End of the Soviet Union. On the 25th of December 1991, Gorbachev resigns. The Soviet Union is dissolved into 15 states, biggest one being Russia. Now, Cold War officially ends here. Now, guys, that is the whole of the Cold War in that short amount of time. Guys, I hope this ChronoCram video helped you a lot and you have successfully crammed. If I were you, I would be taking screenshots throughout this video and going back, get the key points in, do whatever, do practice questions, whatever. If you're watching this, I assume you're cramming for a mock or a real GCSE. So I actually hope this helped you. And yeah, have an amazing day and good luck with whatever you're doing, which is Cold War based. Bye-bye.